3 gunshots in the night. A senator, his wife, their 8-year-old son, all dead. And sitting calmly on the front porch, blood-spattered pajamas catching the red and blue of approaching sirens, was the killer. She was 13 years old. She was their daughter. But this wasn't a tragedy. This wasn't a child breaking under pressure. This was a performance, months in the making. Detective Savannah Garcia would later discover something that made even seasoned homicide investigators pause. Practice videos. Dozens of them. A 13-year-old girl, alone in her bathroom, rehearsing her 911 call over and over, perfecting every sob, every tremor in her voice, every word designed to convince the world that someone else had destroyed her family. What you're about to hear isn't just a murder case. It's a descent into the mind of someone who believed she'd committed the perfect crime. And she almost did. Before we dive deeper into this case, I need to ask you for 2 quick things. First, if you're finding this as gripping as I am, hit that subscribe button. It really helps us bring you more stories like this. Second, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love hearing from you all around the world. Now, let's get back to that horrific night in Austin, Texas. The call came in at 11:47 p.m. on March 19, 2021. A young girl's voice, trembling and breathless, reported that someone had broken into her family's home in the affluent West Lake Hills neighborhood of Austin, Texas. She said she could hear gunshots. She said she was hiding. She said she thought her family was dead. The 911 dispatcher, a veteran named Carol Henderson, who'd taken thousands of emergency calls over her 15-year career, would later testify that something about this particular call felt rehearsed, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what triggered that instinct at the time. What Henderson didn't know, what nobody knew in those first critical minutes, was that the girl on the other end of that call had been practicing that exact performance for 2 weeks. Every word, every pause, every carefully calibrated sob. She'd filmed herself dozens of times, refining her technique like an actress preparing for the role of a lifetime. And in a way, that's exactly what it was, because Emma Grace Girtz wasn't calling for help. She was creating an alibi. By the time the first patrol units screamed up the circular driveway of the Girtz estate at 11:53 p.m., just 6 minutes after the call, the mansion's pale stone exterior was already bathed in alternating waves of red and blue light. Officers Marcus Chun and Patricia Alvarez approached with weapons drawn, their training telling them to expect either an active shooter situation or a traumatized child in immediate danger. What they found instead was something far more unsettling. Emma Grace Girtz was sitting perfectly still on the top step of the porch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, like she was waiting for a school bus rather than first responders to a triple homicide. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail despite the late hour. Her wide blue eyes looked up at the officers with an expression that Officer Chun would later describe as almost curious, certainly not terrified. "He ran out the back," she said, pointing toward the rear of the property with one small, blood-stained hand. "I think he went through the woods." Her voice had that same trembling quality from the 911 call, but something about the whole scene felt wrong to Chun. He couldn't articulate exactly what triggered his instincts. Maybe it was 20 years of police work. Maybe it was something more primal. But standing there looking at this 13-year-old girl covered in blood spatter, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Here's what made Chun pause. Emma had distinct blood patterns across the front and sleeves of her white pajamas, but not a single scratch on her body. No bruises. No defensive wounds. Despite claiming she'd been hiding from an armed intruder who'd just murdered her entire family, her breathing was steady and controlled. Her pupils responded normally to the patrol car lights. None of the physiological markers of genuine shock or trauma that officers learn to recognize in their first year on the job were present. When Alvarez asked if she was hurt, Emma shook her head with an expression that seemed almost practiced, then delivered another perfectly calibrated line. "I heard the shots and I hid in my closet until it was quiet." The officers cleared the house using standard tactical procedures, moving through the palatial first floor with its marble entryways and expensive artwork, then up the curved staircase to the second level where the bedrooms were located. What they found would be seared into their memories forever. In the master bedroom, Senator Daniel Girtz, 46 years old, a rising star in Texas politics, lay face up on the floor near the bed, a single gunshot wound to the center of his chest. His eyes were still open, frozen in what looked like surprise, as if his last conscious thought had been an inability to comprehend what was happening to him. In the hallway just outside, Victoria Girtz, 44, the senator's wife and former campaign manager, had collapsed near the top of the stairs. She'd been shot twice in the back, and the blood trail told a horrific story. She'd been trying to run, probably toward her son's room, when the second shot dropped her. And then there was Ethan, 8 years old, found in his race car-themed bedroom, tucked into bed with his dinosaur print comforter pulled up to his chin. A single fatal shot to the head, a stuffed green Tyrannosaurus still clutched in his small hands. By all appearances, he'd never woken up. He'd simply ceased to exist between one breath and the next, his last dreams unknown and unknowable. By midnight, the Girtz estate had transformed into a chaotic crime scene, with multiple agencies responding to what was being treated as a home invasion turned triple homicide. The Austin Police Department's Homicide Division arrived first, followed by crime scene investigators with their equipment cases and evidence bags, the medical examiner's office with their body transport van, and, because the victim was a sitting state senator, representatives from both the Texas Rangers and the FBI. The political implications of a senator's murder meant this case would have visibility and scrutiny from the highest levels. Nobody wanted to make a mistake. Emma was wrapped in a blanket and placed in the back of a patrol car. Not under arrest. She was, after all, supposedly the sole survivor of a violent home invasion, but certainly not free to leave. She was a witness. She was evidence. And to at least one person on scene that night, she was already something more. Detective Savannah Garcia of the Austin PD Homicide Division pulled up to the scene at 12:20 a.m., and her 15 years of experience told her immediately that this case was going to be a nightmare of politics, media attention, and pressure from above. Garcia was a sharp-featured woman in her early 40s with dark hair always pulled back in a severe bun. She was known throughout the department for two things: her relentless attention to detail and her ability to spot inconsistencies that others missed. As she ducked under the crime scene tape and approached the house, she saw Emma Grace Girtz in the patrol car, still wrapped in that blanket, still perfectly calm. Their eyes met through the window for just a moment, and Garcia felt a cold finger trace down her spine. The girl's expression wasn't that of a traumatized survivor. It was the look of someone waiting for the next scene to begin, like an actress in the wings, listening for her cue. Garcia's first walkthrough of the crime scene only deepened her unease. The timeline Emma had provided in her 911 call didn't match the evidence. She'd claimed the shooting was happening right then, that she could hear someone moving around downstairs while she hid. But the bodies showed early signs of cooling and rigor mortis that suggested they'd been dead for at least 30 minutes before the call came in. That's not a small discrepancy. That's the difference between a panicked call for help during an active crime and a staged performance after the fact. The blood spatter patterns told their own story, and it wasn't the story of a panicked intruder firing randomly. Each victim had been shot with precision. The senator had been standing when the bullet struck his chest. The blood pool underneath him suggested he'd fallen and bled out exactly where he died, with no evidence of a struggle. Victoria had been shot in the back while fleeing, probably awakened by the first shot and making a desperate attempt to reach her son. And Ethan had been shot while he slept, the bullet trajectory and lack of defensive positioning confirming he'd never had a chance to react. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. No broken windows. No kicked-in doors. No ransacked rooms suggesting robbery. No overturned furniture indicating a struggle. The security system hadn't been triggered. Nothing was missing from the home. Not the expensive electronics in plain view. Not Victoria's jewelry box sitting open on her dresser. Not the senator's Rolex watch still on his nightstand. If an intruder had been here, they'd somehow entered a locked house, murdered 3 people with surgical precision, and left without taking a single item or leaving a single trace of their presence. Possible. Maybe. Likely. Not even close. What troubled Garcia most was Emma's story about hiding in her closet during the attack. When investigators examined the girl's bedroom, an expensively decorated space with a canopy bed, built-in bookshelves, and designer furniture that probably cost more than most people's cars, they found the closet door standing wide open. The interior was perfectly organized, with color-coded clothes still neatly arranged on their hangers. If Emma had truly been cowering in terror for 20 or 30 minutes while a murderer stalked through her house, there should have been some evidence of her presence. disturbed shoes where she'd crouched, wrinkled clothes she'd pressed against. Anything. Instead, the closet looked like it had been staged for a magazine photo shoot, untouched and pristine. At 1:15 a.m., Garcia made the decision to conduct a preliminary interview with Grace Girtz. In homicide investigations, every minute counts in those crucial first hours. Memories are freshest. Details haven't had time to be forgotten or unconsciously altered. And if someone is lying, they haven't had time to perfect their story or coordinate with potential accomplices. Garcia had Emma brought into a family room away from the primary crime scenes, set up a video camera to record the conversation, and sat across from her with a gentle expression that masked the suspicion growing in her gut. "Emma, I know this is incredibly hard," Garcia said in her most sympathetic voice, pulling out a notebook. "But I need you to walk me through everything that happened tonight. Start from when you first heard something wrong." Emma's performance in that first interview was note perfect. Each pause and tremor calibrated for maximum effect. She described hearing loud bangs that woke her from sleep. She explained how she'd immediately hidden in her closet and pulled the door closed, a detail that would later prove problematic given the closet's condition. She detailed the terrifying minutes of silence before she dared to emerge and find her family dead. She cried at appropriate moments, when describing finding her little brother, when talking about calling 911. But Garcia, who had interviewed hundreds of traumatized witnesses and victims over her career, recognized the difference between genuine emotion and theatrical reproduction. And this was definitely the latter. The tears never quite reached Emma's eyes. They never disrupted her careful articulation of the story. They came and went with suspicious convenience, appearing exactly when they would be most effective and disappearing the moment they'd served their purpose. Real trauma doesn't work like that. Real trauma is messy and unpredictable. It makes people lose their train of thought, repeat themselves, struggle to find words for the horror they've experienced. Emma's narrative was too clean, too linear, too perfect. The red flags multiplied as the interview continued. When Garcia asked specific questions about the timeline, "What time did you go to bed? When exactly did you hear the first shot? How long did you wait before calling 911? Emma's answers became vague and contradictory. She claimed she'd been asleep at 11 p.m., but also mentioned she'd been reading a book on her phone until 11:30. She said the shots woke her, but also that she'd heard footsteps on the stairs before the shots rang out. Most tellingly, when Garcia asked her to describe the intruder she claimed to have glimpsed running away, Emma provided a description so generic it could have fit millions of people, tall, wearing dark clothes, maybe a man. No distinguishing features. No specific clothing details. Nothing that could actually help investigators identify a suspect. Garcia wrapped up the interview around 2 a.m., thanked Emma for her cooperation, and watched as Child Protective Services took her away for temporary placement. Then she walked back out to the crime scene, where investigators were still documenting every inch of the death house, and made a phone call to her lieutenant. "We need to treat the daughter as a suspect," she said quietly, watching the evidence text work. "I don't know how or why yet, but I'm telling you, that girl killed her family." As dawn broke over Austin, Texas on March 20th, 2021, Detective Savannah Garcia stood in the Girtz family driveway, watching the medical examiner's team load 3 body bags into their van. She'd been awake for over 24 hours, running on coffee and adrenaline, her mind cataloging every inconsistency she'd noted in the past 8 hours. The media had already begun to gather beyond the police barricades. News vans with satellite dishes extended, reporters doing stand-ups with the estate's stone facade in the background. The story was already being framed as a tragic home invasion that took the life of a prominent senator and his family. But Garcia's instincts, honed over a decade and a half of homicide investigations, were screaming that the narrative being sold to the public was fundamentally wrong. The thing about murder investigations is that they're rarely solved by dramatic breakthroughs or sudden revelations. They're solved by patient, methodical accumulation of evidence. One small inconsistency leads to another. A timeline doesn't quite match. A story changes slightly in the retelling. Physical evidence contradicts a witness statement. And slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, the truth emerges. Garcia had learned long ago to trust her gut when something felt off, and everything about Grace Girtz's story felt off. Garcia's next step was to interview the first responders in detail, extracting every observation and impression they'd formed before the scene became contaminated with assumptions. She sat down with Officer Marcus Chun in a quiet corner of the command post that had been set up in the Girtz driveway, and Chin's account only reinforced her suspicions. He described Emma's unnaturally calm demeanor on the porch, how her hands had been folded neatly in her lap rather than clasped or wringing in distress, how her voice had sounded rehearsed rather than spontaneous. It was like she was reading from a script, Chin said, struggling to articulate what had bothered him. Every word felt planned. Officer Patricia Alvarez mentioned something Garcia found particularly significant. When they'd asked Emma if she was hurt, the girl's eyes had darted down to her own body as if checking, as if she needed to verify what injuries she was supposed to have. That's not how genuine trauma victims respond. When you've just survived a life-threatening encounter, you know instinctively whether you're injured. You don't need to check. Neither officer had observed any signs of the adrenaline crash that typically follows a genuine life-threatening encounter. No shaking hands, no rapid breathing, no inability to focus. Emma had been collected, composed, and eerily calm. The crime scene investigators began their methodical work as morning light flooded through the Girtz mansion's floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing details that darkness had obscured. And here's where the physical evidence started to dismantle Emma's intruder story piece by piece. The senator's 9mm handgun, a Glock 19 he kept in a biometric safe in his bedroom, had been fired 3 times. Forensic examination confirmed that the 3 shell casings found in the master bedroom came from this weapon. But here was the first major problem with Emma's story. The gun had been found on the floor approximately 6 feet from the senator's body, positioned as if it had been dropped or placed there after his death. Think about that for a moment. If Daniel Girtz had been shot by an intruder, why would his own gun be out of its safe? The biometric safe required his fingerprint to open, so either he'd opened it himself, knowing there was a threat, or someone else had opened it using his finger, which would require cooperation or incapacitation. And if he'd been trying to defend himself with the gun, why wasn't it in his hand, or at least near his body in a position consistent with being dropped during a struggle? The gun's placement suggested it had been carefully positioned after the fact, staged to look like the senator had drawn it in self-defense. Garcia requested a full forensic sweep of Emma's bedroom, and what the investigators found there would become the first crack in the girl's carefully constructed narrative. Hidden in the back of her closet, beneath a pile of winter sweaters that wouldn't be needed in Texas until late autumn, they discovered a loaded spare magazine for the Glock 19. 15 rounds of 9mm ammunition, the same type and brand that had killed 3 people the night before. When Garcia received the call from the forensics team about this discovery, she felt that familiar electric tingle of a case breaking open. The magazine was processed for fingerprints, and the results came back within hours thanks to the expedited handling the case was receiving. Emma Grace Girtz's fingerprints were all over it, clear, unambiguous prints that could only have been left by someone who had handled the ammunition with bare hands. This discovery raised immediate and troubling questions. Why would a 13-year-old girl have touched her father's ammunition? Why would that magazine be hidden in her closet rather than stored with the gun in the biometric safe? And most importantly, how long had it been there? Garcia obtained a warrant for the girl's digital devices, her iPhone, iPad, and laptop. In 2021, teenagers documented virtually everything in their lives through text messages, social media, and apps. If Emma had been planning something, there might be evidence of it in her digital footprint. The devices were seized from Emma's bedroom and rushed to the department's digital forensics lab, where analysts began the painstaking process of extracting data, recovering deleted files, and reconstructing the digital life of a girl who might have just murdered her entire family. While waiting for the digital forensics results, Garcia began interviewing neighbors, teachers, and anyone who had regular contact with the Girtz family. She needed to understand the dynamics of this household, the relationships, the potential motives. The picture that emerged was complex and deeply troubling. Senator Daniel Girtz was known publicly as a rising star in Texas politics, a conservative Democrat who positioned himself as a family values candidate. But behind closed doors, multiple sources described him as controlling and image-obsessed. His entire life was his political career, and his family existed primarily as props to support that career. Victoria Girtz, his wife, had given up her successful career as a political consultant to manage his campaigns, and raise their children. Neighbors reported that she seemed increasingly isolated and stressed in the months before her death, hosting fewer social gatherings, looking exhausted at the school pickup line, responding to friendly inquiries with forced smiles that never reached her eyes. One neighbor, who asked to remain anonymous, told Garcia that she'd seen Victoria crying in her car in the driveway on at least 2 occasions in the weeks before the murders. As for Emma, her teachers described a troubling transformation. She'd been a bright and engaged student in elementary school, creative, enthusiastic, always participating in class discussions. But over the past year, she'd become withdrawn and listless. Her grades had dropped from A's to C's. Her participation in class activities had faded to nothing. She'd quit the drama club she'd loved. She'd stopped playing soccer despite being one of the team's best players. It was as if someone had dimmed the light inside her, leaving only a hollow shell going through the motions of being a teenager. The most revealing interview came from Emma's school counselor, a woman named Rebecca Martinez, who had been trying unsuccessfully to get the Girtz parents to agree to a mental health evaluation for their daughter. Martinez told Garcia that Emma had come to her office 3 times in the past semester, each time appearing more desperate and disconnected. She'd talked vaguely about not being able to be herself at home and feeling like she was disappearing. The language was concerning enough that Martinez had called Victoria Girtz to suggest therapy. The response, according to Martinez's contemporaneous notes, had been dismissive and defensive. Victoria had insisted that Emma was just going through typical teenage drama and that the family handled their own problems privately. When Martinez pressed the issue, mentioning that Emma seemed genuinely distressed, Victoria had become angry and accused the counselor of overstepping her bounds. The conversation had ended with Victoria making it clear that further discussion was not welcome. Martinez's notes from her meetings with Emma, which she provided to Garcia with appropriate legal authorization, painted a picture of a girl under immense psychological pressure, medicated for depression and anxiety, controlled to the point of suffocation, and increasingly seeing no way out of her situation. On March 22nd, 2 days after the murders, the digital forensics team delivered their preliminary findings to Garcia. And what they'd uncovered was nothing short of explosive. Emma's phone contained multiple deleted TikTok draft videos, the kind of videos that teenagers film but never post, saved in the app's private draft folder. These particular drafts had been filmed in Emma's bathroom with the door locked, and they showed her practicing different versions of a 911 call. In video after video, Emma experimented with the level of panic in her voice, the timing of her sobs, the specific words she would use to report an intruder. The videos were time-stamped over a period of 2 weeks leading up to the murders. There were dozens of takes where Emma refined her performance like an actress preparing for an audition. In the early videos, her performance was clumsy and unconvincing. The pauses felt wrong. The emotion seemed forced. Her facial expressions didn't match the terror she was trying to convey. But as the timestamps progressed, her technique improved dramatically. By the final drafts, recorded just 1 day before the murders, Emma had perfected a performance that sounded utterly authentic. The trembling voice, the hitched breathing, the specific phrasing that communicated both terror and confusion without providing details that could later be contradicted. Garcia watched these videos in the forensics lab, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't a teenager who had snapped under pressure and committed a crime of passion. This was someone who had planned murder with chilling calculation, who had literally practiced the lie she would tell afterward, who had refined her deception until it was perfect. The videos showed a level of premeditation that was rare even in adult offenders, let alone a 13-year-old child. But the TikTok videos were just the beginning. The forensics team had also recovered entries from a journaling app called Locked Journal that Emma had believed were permanently deleted after she'd removed the app from her phone. The app marketed itself as a secure digital diary with encryption and password protection, claiming that deleted entries were unrecoverable. But forensic software could access the phone's underlying database files where fragments of the entries remained, and what those entries revealed would transform this case from suspicious to undeniable. The locked journal entries were a window into the dark psychology of a girl who had been planning murder for months. In entries dating back 3 months before the killings, Emma wrote about discovering that her parents were planning to send her to a behavioral modification program called New Horizons in Utah. a facility with a reputation for brutal discipline and psychological breaking techniques. She described being medicated into compliance, forced to take pills that made her feel like a zombie, and constantly compared unfavorably to her younger brother Ethan, who was the golden child in her father's eyes. But what made these entries evidence of premeditated murder rather than just teenage venting was how they evolved over time. The early entries were angry and despairing, the kind of thing any mistreated teenager might write. But by January 2021, the entries had shifted from expressing emotion to planning action. Emma wrote about researching her father's gun, about learning how to operate it, about considering different scenarios for how the murders could be carried out. One entry from late January was particularly chilling. "I've been thinking about Dad's gun. If I could get it, I could end this. All of it. Start over completely." The entries grew increasingly specific and detailed as the murder date approached. Emma documented her research into crime scene investigation techniques. What evidence would investigators look for? How they determined time of death? What made a 911 call sound genuine versus fake? She wrote about the importance of waiting between the murders and the phone call to allow time for staging, but not waiting so long that rigor mortis would make the timeline obviously wrong. In one entry from February 17th, just a month before the murders, Emma laid out her complete plan. Kill Dad first because he's the biggest threat, then Mom when she comes to check on the noise, then Ethan last because I don't want him to be scared. Make it look like someone broke in. Put blood on my clothes, but not too much. Practice the 911 call until it's perfect. Wait 15 to 20 minutes after the last shot before calling. Sit on the porch so I'm the first thing police see. Garcia read through these journal entries with a mixture of horror and grim satisfaction. Horror at the calculated nature of the killings. Satisfaction that the case was now undeniable. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a teenager snapping under pressure in a moment of temporary insanity. This was premeditated murder, planned over months, practiced and refined until Emma Grace Girtz felt confident she could execute her family and escape justice by playing the role of traumatized survivor. But there was still one crucial piece of evidence Garcia needed to completely demolish Emma's timeline, something that would prove, beyond any possible doubt, that Emma was lying about when the murders occurred. And that evidence came from an unexpected source, the neighbor's doorbell camera. Robert Patterson, the retired civil engineer who lived in the estate next door, had mentioned his Ring doorbell system to investigating officers on the morning after the murders. He'd offered to provide any footage or audio that might help identify the supposed intruder. Patterson's doorbell system was positioned on his front porch approximately 150 feet from the Girtz estate's main entrance. The high-sensitivity microphones, designed to pick up conversations and approaching footsteps, had captured something far more significant than anyone expected. When forensic audio specialists enhanced and analyzed the recording from the night of March 19th, they found 3 distinct gunshot sounds, the sharp, unmistakable cracks of a 9mm handgun being fired. The timestamps were unambiguous: 11:27 p.m., 11:28 p.m., and 11:29 p.m. Emma's 911 call, claiming an attack was happening in real time, came through at 11:47 p.m., a full 18 to 20 minutes after the actual murders. The audio analysis team provided Garcia with a detailed technical breakdown. After that third shot at 11:29 p.m., the recording captured 18 minutes and 6 seconds of silence before Emma's voice could be heard on the phone with 911, already speaking from the front porch. During those 18 minutes, the doorbell system detected no sounds of running footsteps, no car engine starting, no evidence whatsoever of an intruder fleeing the scene. When Garcia played the enhanced audio recording for the assembled prosecution team, the room fell into stunned silence. The contrast between the objective timestamp evidence and Emma's 911 call was devastating. On the recording of her emergency call, Emma could be heard saying, "I think he's still in the house," and "I can hear someone downstairs," statements that were demonstrably false given that the actual murders had occurred nearly 20 minutes earlier. The doorbell audio didn't just undermine Emma's story. It obliterated it completely. Garcia now had everything she needed. Motive documented in Emma's journal entries, means proved by the fingerprints on the spare magazine, opportunity confirmed by her presence in the house, and timeline evidence that proved her 911 call was a performance rather than a genuine emergency. On March 26th, exactly 1 week after the murders, Emma Grace Girtz was formally arrested and charged with 3 counts of capital murder. And because of her age and the calculated nature of the crimes, prosecutors would make a decision that would ignite a national firestorm. They would charge her as an adult under Texas's controversial new Adult Accountability Act. The question now wasn't whether Emma had killed her family. The evidence made that undeniable. The question was whether a 13-year-old girl could, or should, face the same consequences as an adult who had committed the same crimes. The forensic examination of Emma Girtz's digital devices revealed something that even seasoned investigators found deeply unsettling. Not just evidence of a crime, but a documentary record of how a 13-year-old girl had methodically prepared herself to commit murder and lie about it afterward. Lead digital forensics analyst Marcus Webb, a specialist who had worked hundreds of cases involving electronic evidence, told Detective Garcia that in his 12 years examining phones and computers for criminal investigations, he had never seen such comprehensive digital documentation of murder planning. Adults rarely left such detailed evidence trails. That a child had done so suggested either remarkable sophistication or a fundamental disconnect from the reality that digital evidence could be recovered. The recovery process itself was technically complex and time-consuming. Emma's iPhone 12, seized from her bedroom on the night of the murders, contained what manufacturers claimed was permanently erased data. But specialized forensic software could reconstruct fragments of deleted files from the phone's memory, piecing them together like a digital jigsaw puzzle. Skilled technicians spent 3 days of continuous work extracting these fragments, and what emerged was a chilling portrait of premeditation that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. The TikTok draft videos were the most visually disturbing evidence, recorded selfie-style in Emma's bathroom between March 5th and March 18th, 2021. For those unfamiliar with how TikTok works, the app allows users to create videos and save them as private drafts without posting them publicly. These drafts remain on the device unless deliberately deleted, creating a hidden archive of content the user never intended anyone else to see. Emma had created 37 separate practice videos, and watching them in chronological order was like witnessing the birth of a performance. In the earliest videos, Emma's 911 performance was clumsy and unconvincing. Her voice cracked in the wrong places. Her pauses felt unnatural. Her facial expressions didn't match the terror she was trying to convey in her words. She looked like exactly what she was, a teenager playing at being scared rather than genuinely experiencing fear. But over the course of 2 weeks, her technique improved with the dedication of a method actor preparing for Broadway. She experimented with different approaches. Should she sound hysterical or controlled? Crying throughout or intermittently? Speaking quickly in panic or slowly in shock? By the final drafts, recorded just 1 day before the murders, Emma had perfected a performance that sounded utterly authentic. The trembling voice that conveyed terror without descending into incoherence. The hitched breathing that suggested someone trying to maintain composure in the face of horror. The specific phrasing that communicated both fear and confusion without providing details that could later be contradicted by evidence. It was, in the most disturbing possible way, a masterclass in deception. The progression of these videos revealed Emma's awareness of exactly what investigators would listen for in a genuine 911 call. She wasn't just practicing words. She was studying the psychology of fear and trauma, then reproducing it artificially. In some videos, she experimented with background noise, at one point playing sound effects of doors creaking on her iPad, while recording herself on her phone to create ambient fear. She practiced different versions of the critical moment when she would report finding her family. Too emotional sounded fake. Too calm sounded suspicious. So she settled on a carefully calibrated middle ground that sounded like shock temporarily overriding grief, the kind of dissociation that's actually common in genuine trauma victims. What made these videos particularly damning was evidence of her analytical approach to deception. In one deleted draft that forensics recovered, Emma had actually recorded herself saying, "I think I hear him leaving." But then she deleted that video and never used that line again. Why? Presumably because she realized that if she claimed to hear the intruder leaving, police would wonder why she hadn't tried to see who it was or get a better description. She was thinking through the implications of every statement, anticipating how investigators would respond, and adjusting her story accordingly. This wasn't instinctive lying. This was calculated strategic deception. The locked journal app entries, which Emma had deleted from her phone 10 days before the murders, believing they were permanently erased, provided the other half of the picture, the psychological evolution from angry teenager to someone actively planning triple homicide. The app, marketed as a secure digital diary with encryption and password protection, claimed that deleted entries were unrecoverable. But forensic software accessed the phone's underlying database files where fragments of the entries remained, and recovering them was like finding the killer's confession written in invisible ink. The earliest recovered entry was dated December 14, 2020, 3 months before the murders, and it began with a simple, chilling statement. "I found out today that they're sending me away to New Horizons in Utah. They think I don't know, but I heard Mom on the phone with the intake coordinator. I would rather die than go there. Or maybe they should die instead." That last sentence, "maybe they should die instead," marked the moment when Emma's thinking shifted from self-directed despair to outward-directed violence. It was the seed of what would become a murder plot. Subsequent journal entries documented Emma's research into the New Horizons behavioral modification program, and what she discovered clearly terrified her. She'd found testimonials from former residents describing forced exercise until vomiting, isolation cells, restricted communication with family, and psychological techniques designed to break down resistance and rebuild compliant behavior. Whether these descriptions were accurate or exaggerated didn't matter for the legal case. What mattered was that Emma believed them, and that belief became her motive for murder. She wrote extensively about her rage at being considered the family's problem child while her younger brother Ethan was praised and celebrated, describing herself as the defective product they need to send back for repairs. The entries also revealed Emma's complicated relationship with the medications she'd been prescribed, Zoloft and Ritalin for depression and ADHD, later supplemented with Ativan for anxiety. She wrote about feeling like a zombie, about emotions being behind a glass wall, about being unable to cry even when she wanted to. The defense would later use these descriptions to argue that the medications had impaired her judgment and emotional regulation. But the prosecution would counter that her detailed planning showed someone whose cognitive functions were operating at a very high level, regardless of how the medications affected her emotional state. By January 2021, Emma's journal entries shifted from venting anger to considering concrete action, and this was where the evidence of premeditation became legally irrefutable. On January 23rd, she wrote, "I've been thinking about Dad's gun. He showed it to me once, explaining how it works because he said I should know about firearm safety. He keeps it in a biometric safe in his closet, but I've seen him open it enough times that I know where he stores the backup key, taped under his desk drawer. If I could get the gun, I could end this. All of it. Start over completely." This entry established that Emma had been thinking about using her father's weapon more than 2 months before she actually did so, a timeline that would prove crucial for the prosecution's premeditation argument. First-degree murder requires proof that the killing was planned in advance, not committed in the heat of passion. 2 months of documented planning was about as clear as premeditation evidence gets, and the fact that she'd written it down, preserved it in a digital journal, showed a level of confidence that she wouldn't be caught, or perhaps a psychological need to document what she was planning, to make it real through writing. The journal entries from February 2021 showed Emma actively planning the logistics of the murders with a level of detail that seemed impossible for a 13-year-old. She researched how long it takes for gunshot wounds to be fatal. She looked up how to stage a crime scene to look like a home invasion. She studied what investigators look for when determining if a 911 call is genuine versus fake. She wrote about the importance of waiting between the murders and the phone call to allow time for staging, but not waiting so long that rigor mortis would make the timeline obviously wrong. This was criminal planning that would be sophisticated for an adult. For a middle schooler, it was almost incomprehensible. In one entry from February 17th, Emma laid out her complete plan with the clinical precision of a military operation. Kill Dad first because he's the biggest threat, then Mom when she comes to check on the noise, then Ethan last because I don't want him to be scared. Make it look like someone broke in. Put blood on my clothes, but not too much. Practice the 911 call until it's perfect. Wait 15 to 20 minutes after the last shot before calling. Sit on the porch so I'm the first thing police see." Reading this entry, prosecutors knew they had something extraordinary. Not just evidence of guilt, but evidence of the kind of calculated, methodical planning that's usually only seen in adult serial killers or professional criminals. The forensics team also recovered Emma's search history from Safari and Chrome browsers on both her phone and iPad, revealing a disturbing pattern of research into true crime cases, 911 protocols, and crime scene investigation techniques. Between January and March 2021, she had watched dozens of true crime documentaries on YouTube and Netflix, paying particular attention to episodes that discussed how investigators caught killers through timeline inconsistencies and physical evidence. She'd researched gunshot residue, what it was, how long it remained on skin and clothing, whether it could be washed off. She'd looked up DNA evidence retention times and whether fingerprints could be wiped clean from surfaces. Most tellingly, she had watched multiple episodes of shows like Forensic Files and The First 48 that specifically featured cases where family members had killed their relatives and tried to blame unknown intruders. She was studying the playbook of failed family annihilators, learning from their mistakes, understanding why they'd been caught, and planning how to avoid the same errors. One of her YouTube search queries, recovered from her deleted history, was particularly chilling. How long after death does rigor mortis start? She'd clicked on medical websites and forensic pathology resources, educating herself on the physical signs of death that would help her calibrate her timeline. This research history showed something crucial that the prosecution would hammer home at trial. Emma knew what she was planning was wrong and would be investigated as a crime. She wasn't operating under some delusion that killing her family was acceptable or legal. She understood that murder would bring police investigation, forensic analysis, and criminal prosecution, and she was taking active steps to avoid detection. The law distinguishes between someone who commits a crime impulsively without considering consequences and someone who commits a crime while actively planning how to evade justice. Emma's digital footprint put her firmly in the latter category. Prosecutor Dylan Torres recognized that the TikTok drafts and journal entries were the strongest evidence of premeditation he'd ever seen in any case, let alone one involving a juvenile defendant. These weren't the impulsive, poorly planned actions of an abused child snapping under pressure. This was systematic, calculated planning executed with chilling patience. But Torres also knew that the defense would use the same evidence to argue that Emma's psychological state was severely compromised, that her obsessive planning and documentation actually demonstrated mental illness rather than criminal sophistication. So Torres arranged for Dr. Michael Chun, a forensic psychologist specializing in adolescent psychology, to review all the digital evidence and provide an analysis of Emma's mental state and development. Dr. Chin spent 2 weeks reviewing the journal entries, TikTok videos, and text messages before providing his preliminary assessment, and his conclusion was both troubling and legally significant. Emma Grace Girtz demonstrated intellectual and emotional sophistication far beyond typical 13-year-old development, but her moral reasoning and impulse control showed significant deficits. She could plan, execute, and attempt to deceive with adult-level capabilities, but she appeared to have limited capacity for empathy or genuine remorse, particularly regarding her brother's death. The digital evidence also revealed Emma's relationships with her family members in the months leading up to the murders through recovered text message threads. Her communication with her parents was increasingly cold and perfunctory, mostly her mother asking about homework or after-school activities, with Emma responding in monosyllables. There were no affectionate exchanges, no casual conversation, nothing that suggested warmth or connection. In contrast, Emma's messages with school friends showed a completely different personality: funny, engaged, capable of expressing emotions and sharing experiences. It was as if she existed as two separate people: the compliant, medicated daughter at home and the real Emma who only emerged outside her family's presence. One particularly significant deleted text thread from late February 2021 showed Emma discussing the Utah Behavioral Modification Program with a friend named Sarah Martinez. Emma had written, "My parents are sending me to basically prison because I vaped once. Meanwhile, golden boy Ethan can do whatever he wants. I asked them not to send me, and they said it's already decided. Like I don't even get a say in my own life." Sarah had responded with sympathy and suggestions to talk to a school counselor, but Emma's final message in that thread was chilling in retrospect. "Don't worry about it. I'm going to handle the situation myself. They won't be able to send me anywhere soon. Forensic analysis showed that Emma had deleted this entire conversation thread on March 18th, one day before the murders, apparently recognizing that it could be interpreted as evidence of planning. But like so many people who believe deleted digital data is truly gone forever, she was wrong. The deletion actually made the evidence more damning because it showed consciousness of guilt. Innocent people don't systematically delete conversations the day before a tragedy. They have no reason to. Emma's deletion of potentially incriminating evidence showed she understood that what she was planning would be investigated, and she was trying to eliminate anything that could point to premeditation. When the prosecution team compiled all the digital evidence into a comprehensive presentation for the grand jury, a visual timeline showing the progression from angry venting to murder planning to performance practice, the deliberation lasted less than 3 hours before they returned indictments on 3 counts of capital murder with special circumstances. The evidence was simply overwhelming. The grand jurors could watch Emma practicing her lies, read her documenting her murder plans, and see her researching how to avoid detection. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. The digital footprint had turned what might have been a circumstantial case into one of the most well-documented premeditated murders in Texas criminal history. Emma Grace Girtz, age 13, would stand trial as an adult under New Franklin's controversial Adult Accountability Act, facing the possibility of execution if convicted. And the evidence that would be used to prosecute her wasn't testimony that could be disputed or physical evidence that could be explained away. It was her own words, her own images, her own documented planning. She had, in effect, created the case against herself, one deleted file at a time. To understand how a 13-year-old girl could plan and execute the murder of her entire family, you have to understand who Emma Grace Girtz was before that night in March, and more importantly, who her family needed her to be. Because the story of Emma's descent into homicidal planning doesn't begin with anger or hatred or even desperation. It begins with erasure. The slow, systematic dismantling of a child's identity in service of an image that had nothing to do with who she actually was. Emma was born on October 7, 2007, in Austin, Texas, the first child of Daniel and Victoria Girtz. By all accounts, her early childhood was relatively normal, even happy. Home videos recovered by investigators showed a bright, energetic little girl, blonde pigtails bouncing as she ran through sprinklers in the backyard, chocolate cake smeared across her face at birthday parties, gap-toothed grins for the camera. Her kindergarten teacher described her as a delight, creative, curious, always the first to raise her hand with an answer or observation. She made friends easily. She loved art class and dress-up games. She was, in every measurable way, a typical, well-adjusted child. But something shifted when Emma was around 9 years old, right around the time her father decided to run for state senate. Politics consumed the Girtz household like a wildfire, burning through whatever normalcy had existed and leaving nothing but carefully constructed public image in its wake. Daniel Girtz was a man who understood that modern politics is as much about branding as policy, and his brand was built on traditional family values: the devoted husband, the attentive father, the wholesome all-American family. The problem was that real families are messy, complicated, and unpredictable. So the Girtzes would simply have to become less real and more brand. Victoria sat Emma down one afternoon. Emma was in 4th grade at the time, and explained that things were going to be different now. They were going to be a public family, which meant people would be watching them, judging them, forming opinions about her father based on how the family presented themselves. Emma needed to be more careful about how she dressed, what she said in public, how she behaved at campaign events. It wasn't enough to be good. She needed to look good, to project an image of perfect childhood that voters would find appealing and trustworthy. At first, Emma tried to comply. She let her mother select her outfits for public appearances, matching dresses in patriotic colors, hair bows that coordinated with the campaign's branding. She smiled for photographs at fundraising dinners, sat quietly through speeches she didn't understand, shook hands with strangers who patted her head, and told her father what a lovely daughter he had. But the control kept expanding, creeping into every corner of her life like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. Soon it wasn't just about public appearances, it was about everything. Her social media accounts were monitored, then restricted, then eventually deleted entirely because Victoria worried about Emma posting something that could be taken out of context or used against her father. Her friendships were managed based on whether the parents were politically useful. She could be friends with the daughter of a major donor, but not with the girl whose father had written a critical op-ed about her dad's voting record. Her extracurricular activities were evaluated not on Emma's interests or talents, but on their optics. Drama club was eliminated because Victoria said it would make Emma too comfortable with lying and pretending to be someone else, an irony that would become painfully apparent later. Soccer was cut because weekend games interfered with campaign events. The teachers who knew Emma during this period noticed the change. Mrs. Patricia Wilson, her fifth-grade teacher, testified later that Emma had been one of her star students. Creative, engaged, always volunteering answers in class discussions, enthusiastic about every project. But by sixth grade, something had shifted. Emma became withdrawn, listless, her former spark seemingly extinguished. Her grades dropped. Her participation in class faded. She stopped turning in the creative writing assignments she'd once excelled at. It was like watching a light dim, Wilson said. I asked her parents to come in for a conference because I was genuinely concerned about the dramatic change. That conference didn't go as Wilson had hoped. Victoria Girtz arrived alone. The senator was too busy with campaign obligations, and she made it immediately clear that she wasn't interested in hearing concerns about Emma's behavior. When Wilson gently suggested that Emma might be struggling with the pressure of being in a political family, Victoria became defensive. Emma was going through typical preteen adjustment issues, she said, and they were handling it with medication and discipline. The message was clear. The school's job was to educate, not to question the family's choices. Further discussion was not welcome. The medication began around this time, shortly after Emma had what Victoria described as an inappropriate public outburst at one of her father's campaign events. Emma, bored after hours of standing around while adults talked politics, had complained loudly that she wanted to go home, that these events were boring, that she didn't want to smile for any more photographs. For most 10-year-olds, this would be considered normal behavior. For Emma, in the context of her father's carefully managed public image, it was a crisis requiring intervention. Within a week, Emma was sitting in a psychiatrist's office, someone Victoria's friend had recommended, someone who understood the unique pressures of high-profile families. The appointment lasted maybe 20 minutes. Emma described feeling sad sometimes, having trouble focusing in school, worrying about disappointing her parents. The psychiatrist diagnosed her with depression and ADHD and wrote prescriptions for Zoloft and Ritalin. Emma's mother seemed relieved, as if medication was a solution to a problem rather than a band-aid on a wound that ran much deeper. Emma's journal entries from years later would describe the medications as making her feel like a zombie, like everything was happening behind a glass wall. She wrote about emotions being muted, about feeling disconnected from her own life, about the strange experience of going through the motions of being a person without actually feeling like one. When she told the psychiatrist during a follow-up appointment that the medications made her feel numb, his response was to increase the dosage and add Ativan for anxiety. The goal, it seemed, wasn't to help Emma feel better. It was to help her behave better, to be easier to manage, to fit more neatly into the role her family needed her to play. The control extended into areas that most parents wouldn't even think to monitor. Victoria selected Emma's clothes not just for public events, but for everyday wear. Nothing too trendy, nothing that might make her stand out or invite the wrong kind of attention. She monitored Emma's phone with tracking apps and content filters. She insisted on knowing where Emma was at all times, who she was with, what they were discussing. Any request for privacy was met with suspicion. If you don't have anything to hide, you shouldn't mind me checking, turning normal teenage desires for autonomy into evidence of deception or wrongdoing. And then there was Ethan, born when Emma was 5 years old. From the beginning, her little brother seemed to exist in a different world, one where the rules that constrained Emma didn't apply. Ethan could be loud and energetic at campaign events without consequences. He could play sports without worrying about schedule conflicts. He could be messy and imperfect and still be celebrated. The reason was simple. Ethan was the golden child, the son, the heir to whatever political dynasty Daniel Girtz imagined he was building. Emma was the problematic older daughter, the one who needed to be managed and controlled and, eventually, fixed. Multiple sources close to the family described this dynamic. A former housekeeper, speaking anonymously to investigators, said that Daniel would spend hours playing with Ethan, teaching him to throw a football, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories. But with Emma, he was distant, distracted, as if she was an obligation rather than a person he actually wanted to spend time with. Victoria was more involved with Emma's life, but that involvement took the form of management rather than mothering, coordinating schedules, monitoring behavior, ensuring compliance with the family's expectations. Emma's journal entries captured the pain of this differential treatment with the raw honesty that only private writing allows. She wrote about feeling invisible, about being the defective product they need to send back for repairs, about watching Ethan receive praise and affection for simply existing while she had to perform perfection just to avoid criticism. She wrote about understanding, even at 12 and 13, that she was valued not for who she was, but for how successfully she could pretend to be someone else. The breaking point came in late 2020 when Emma, desperate for some sense of control over her own life, experimented with vaping. A single incident with friends from school. Someone's parent found out and called Victoria, who confronted Emma with the kind of fury usually reserved for far more serious transgressions. This wasn't just about the vaping itself, it was about what it represented. Evidence that Emma was making her own choices, influenced by peers rather than parental dictates, engaging in behavior that could become a scandal if it got out. For Victoria and Daniel, this wasn't a normal teenage mistake requiring conversation and consequence. It was proof that Emma was fundamentally broken and needed professional intervention beyond what they could provide at home. That's when they started researching behavioral modification programs, residential facilities designed to reform troubled teenagers through intensive discipline and psychological restructuring. New Horizons in Utah had a website full of testimonials from grateful parents whose defiant children had been transformed into compliant young adults. What the website didn't prominently feature were the allegations of abuse, the lawsuits from former residents, the investigative journalism exposés about isolation cells and forced exercise regimens and psychological techniques that amounted to sanctioned cruelty. Emma discovered the plan by accident, overhearing her mother on the phone with an intake coordinator, providing Emma's medical history and school records, discussing start dates and transportation arrangements. When she confronted her parents that evening, demanding to know if they were really planning to send her away, their response confirmed her worst fears. Yes, they'd made the decision. No, it wasn't up for discussion. Emma was becoming too difficult to manage, and they needed professionals to fix whatever was wrong with her. The program would last 6 to 12 months. She would have limited contact with family during that time. The goal was to break down her resistance and rebuild compliant behavior. For Emma, hearing this felt like a death sentence. She'd researched the facility online, found testimonials from former residents describing conditions that sounded like psychological torture. Kids forced to stand facing a wall for hours as punishment. Isolation cells with no windows. Exercise regimens designed to break them physically when they couldn't be broken mentally. Staff members who would scream in their faces, demean them, strip away any sense of self-worth they had left. Whether these descriptions were entirely accurate or partially exaggerated didn't matter. Emma believed them, and the terror was real. She tried to argue. She promised to behave better, to comply with whatever they wanted, to stop being difficult. But her parents had already decided. The paperwork was being processed. The deposit had been paid. In their minds, this wasn't a punishment. It was an intervention, something they were doing for Emma's own good because they loved her and wanted her to have a successful future. But Emma didn't experience it as love. She experienced it as abandonment, as confirmation that she was so fundamentally unacceptable that her own parents would rather send her away to be broken and rebuilt than accept who she actually was. In the weeks following this discovery, Emma's journal entries shifted from despairing venting to something darker and more purposeful. She stopped writing about how she felt and started writing about what she could do. Running away wouldn't work. She'd be found and brought back, and the situation would be worse. Telling a school counselor wouldn't work. Her father was a powerful senator, and who would believe her over him? Child Protective Services wouldn't intervene based on complaints about strict parenting. Legal emancipation required proving abuse or neglect, and she didn't have evidence that would meet that standard. That left one option she kept returning to in her writing: the one solution that would end the threat permanently and completely. If they were gone, the problem would be solved. It was a thought that should have horrified her, that should have sent her running to find help. But Emma's capacity for normal moral reasoning had been systematically eroded by years of being medicated, controlled, and treated as a problem rather than a person. In her damaged psychology, murdering her family became not an unthinkable horror, but a logical solution to an impossible situation. The final weeks before the murders showed Emma operating with increasingly cold calculation. She researched her father's gun, watching YouTube videos about how to operate a Glock 19. She located the spare magazine and moved it to her closet where she could access it easily. She practiced her 911 call until the performance was perfect. She planned this sequence of killings to minimize suffering. Though her definition of minimizing suffering included shooting her 8-year-old brother in the head while he slept, which revealed just how profoundly disconnected she'd become from normal human empathy. By March 19, 2021, Emma Grace Girtz was no longer the bright, creative little girl from those early home videos. She'd been transformed by years of systematic psychological pressure into something else entirely. Someone capable of looking at her sleeping family and seeing not people she loved, but obstacles that needed to be eliminated. The question that would haunt the trial was whether that transformation was something done to her or something she'd done to herself. Whether she was a victim who became a perpetrator or simply a monster who'd been hiding behind the facade of childhood all along. The legal framework that would determine Emma Grace Girtz's fate had been signed into law on January 15, 2021, just over 2 months before she murdered her family. In a signing ceremony where her own father, Senator Daniel Girtz, had stood beside the governor as one of the bill's primary sponsors. The irony was so stark, so impossibly tragic, that it seemed like something out of a Greek drama rather than real life. A father championing legislation that would allow his own daughter to be executed for murdering him. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of symmetry. The Adult Accountability Act represented a dramatic shift in juvenile justice philosophy in Texas, lowering the age at which minors could be charged as adults for the most serious crimes from 16 to 13, and explicitly making capital punishment available for juveniles who committed multiple homicides with exceptional premeditation. The law's passage had been controversial from the start, sparking protests from child advocacy groups and civil rights organizations who argued it violated international human rights standards and decades of Supreme Court precedent recognizing that children are fundamentally different from adults in their culpability and capacity for rehabilitation. But the act had passed anyway, riding a wave of public anger following several high-profile violent crimes committed by juveniles. Conservative politicians framed it as common-sense accountability. Why should age shield someone from consequences if they're sophisticated enough to plan and execute serious crimes? Progressive activists called it barbaric, a return to a darker era when children could be hanged for crimes they committed before they were old enough to understand the finality of death. Senator Girtz himself had been one of the act's most vocal supporters, arguing in floor speeches that age should not shield violent offenders from consequences, and that some actions are so heinous that they demand adult accountability regardless of the perpetrator's birth date. Now, in a twist so darkly ironic it barely seemed real, the first person to be charged under Senator Girtz's own legislation was his daughter, accused of murdering him along with the rest of his family. The legal team assigned to prosecute Emma's case was led by Dylan Torres, the ambitious prosecutor who had been vocal in supporting the Adult Accountability Act during the legislative debate. Torres was a former defense attorney who'd switched sides after what he described as witnessing too many violent offenders receive lenient sentences only to reoffend. He saw the Girtz case as the perfect test of the new law's constitutionality and effectiveness, and yes, as a career-defining opportunity that could propel him toward higher office. Under the Adult Accountability Act, to charge a minor as an adult for capital murder, the prosecution had to prove 3 elements beyond reasonable doubt: multiple victims, exceptional premeditation demonstrated through planning over time, and aggravating circumstances that elevated the crime beyond a typical murder. The exceptional premeditation requirement was crucial. It represented the legislature's attempt to distinguish between impulsive teenage violence and the kind of calculated planning that suggested adult-level moral culpability. The statute defined it as evidence of sustained planning over a period of weeks or months, including research into methods, practice of deceptive techniques, or documentation of intent through writings, recordings, or other media. Emma's case met this standard almost perfectly, as if she'd been following a checklist designed specifically for the statute. The locked journal entries spanning 3 months. The TikTok practice videos recorded over 2 weeks. The research into forensic investigation techniques. The stolen spare magazine hidden in her closet. All of it combined to create a textbook example of what the law's authors had envisioned when they wrote exceptional premeditation. Torres knew that the digital evidence alone would satisfy even the most skeptical judge that Emma had engaged in the kind of sophisticated, sustained planning the act was designed to address. The aggravating circumstances were similarly clear. The law listed several factors that could elevate a multiple homicide to capital murder: the victim's age or vulnerability, abuse of a position of trust, and murders committed to prevent witnesses from testifying. In the Girtz case, the prosecution could argue all three. 8-year-old Ethan was specifically protected as a vulnerable victim under age 12. Emma had abused her position as a family member to gain access and eliminate suspicion. And the sequential nature of the killings suggested each later victim was murdered to prevent them from identifying Emma as the shooter. Her mother had clearly been awakened by the first shot and was trying to flee when she was killed, and Emma's own statement suggested she'd killed Ethan partly to eliminate him as a witness. On April 6, 2021, 2 weeks after Emma's arrest, the prosecution filed a formal notice of intent to seek the death penalty under the Adult Accountability Act. This filing triggered a mandatory judicial review process. A 3-judge panel would examine the evidence and determine whether the case met the statutory requirements for adult prosecution of a juvenile defendant. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the panel approved adult certification, Emma would face trial in adult criminal court with the possibility of execution. If they rejected it, she'd be tried in juvenile court where the maximum sentence would be detention until age 21, regardless of how heinous her crimes. The hearing, held in a closed courtroom to protect Emma's identity as a minor, lasted 2 full days. Torres presented the digital evidence, playing the TikTok practice videos, reading the journal entries, showing the timeline of research into forensic techniques. He called Detective Garcia to testify about the physical evidence and the impossibility of Emma's intruder story. He brought in forensic psychologist Dr. Michael Chun to explain how Emma's planning demonstrated cognitive sophistication far beyond typical 13-year-old development. The presentation was methodical, comprehensive, and devastating. The defense team, led by renowned juvenile justice attorney Sarah Williams, argued strenuously against adult certification. Williams was a veteran of dozens of juvenile cases, someone who'd built her career on the principle that children are fundamentally different from adults and deserve different treatment in the justice system. She presented expert testimony about adolescent brain development, calling Dr. Jennifer Blackwell, a neuroscientist specializing in teenage cognition. Dr. Blackwell explained that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, long-term planning, and consequential thinking, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s. This means that even Emma's sophisticated planning didn't necessarily reflect adult-level capacity to understand the moral weight of her actions. The teenage brain is still under construction, Dr. Blackwell testified, using visual aids to show brain scans comparing adolescent and adult neural architecture. They can plan, yes. They can deceive, yes. But their ability to fully comprehend long-term consequences, to regulate emotions, to resist impulses, all of those capacities are significantly impaired compared to adults. When we sentence a 13-year-old as an adult, we're essentially pretending that neuroscience doesn't exist. Williams also presented testimony about the effects of trauma and psychological abuse on decision-making, arguing that Emma's home environment had created conditions that fundamentally compromised her judgment. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, the child psychologist who'd evaluated Emma, testified about the impact of years of forced medication, parental control, and the terror of being sent to a facility known for abusive practices. This wasn't a child making free choices, Dr. Warner argued. This was a child whose capacity for normal moral reasoning had been systematically damaged by the very people who should have been protecting her. The 3-judge panel deliberated for 4 days, an agonizingly long wait that suggested serious disagreement among the judges. When they finally issued their ruling on April 9, 2021, it came down 2-1 in favor of adult certification. The majority opinion, written by Judge Patricia Morrison, acknowledged the troubling nature of potentially executing a 13-year-old, but concluded that the evidence of exceptional premeditation was so overwhelming that it demonstrated a level of moral culpability sufficient to justify adult prosecution. Judge Morrison's written opinion carefully walked through the evidence. While the defendant's age is certainly a factor for the jury to consider in determining appropriate punishment, the level of planning, deception, and calculated execution in this case demonstrates capacities that transcend typical juvenile impulsivity. The defendant planned these murders for months, practiced her deception, researched how to avoid detection, and executed her plan with chilling precision. This is not a child who made a terrible mistake in a moment of passion. This is an individual who made deliberate choices over an extended period, with ample opportunity for reflection and reconsideration. The dissenting opinion, written by Judge Marcus Lee, argued that regardless of the sophistication of Emma's planning, the fundamental legal principle that children are less culpable than adults should prevent capital prosecution of any 13-year-old. Judge Lee's dissent was passionate and forceful. The majority's decision effectively holds that a child can think herself into adult culpability. But neuroscience, psychology, and centuries of legal tradition recognize that children, even highly intelligent, calculating children, are fundamentally different from adults in their capacity for moral reasoning and their potential for rehabilitation. To sentence a 13-year-old to death is to declare that she is beyond redemption, beyond growth, beyond the possibility of change that is the very definition of childhood and adolescence. I cannot and will not endorse such a conclusion. With adult certification granted, Emma's case moved forward in the adult criminal justice system, though with some special accommodations for her age. She was held in a juvenile detention facility rather than adult jail. Her court appearances would be closed to the public and media to protect her privacy. Any statements she made to investigators would be subject to enhanced scrutiny regarding voluntariness and Miranda rights. But these protections were relatively minor compared to the enormity of what she now faced, a trial that could end with her execution. The trial was scheduled for September 2021, giving both sides 6 months to prepare. Torres began assembling his witness list and evidence presentation, planning a prosecution that would rely heavily on the digital evidence and timeline reconstruction to prove not just that Emma was guilty, but that she deserved the ultimate penalty. The defense team began building a mitigation case focused on Emma's history of psychological abuse, forced medication, and the terror of being sent to a brutal behavioral modification facility. Sarah Williams hired a team of experts to examine Emma's medical records, interview her teachers and counselors, and reconstruct the environment of control and manipulation she had endured. Williams knew she couldn't realistically challenge the facts of the murders. The evidence was simply too strong. But she could argue that Emma's actions, while legally criminal, were the predictable result of years of systematic psychological damage inflicted by the very people she had killed. The goal wasn't acquittal, which was impossible. The goal was a sentence of life with the possibility of parole rather than death or life without parole. If she could convince the jury that Emma was more victim than monster, more damaged child than calculating killer, maybe, just maybe, they would spare her life. The public reaction to Emma's adult prosecution was immediate and intensely polarized. Conservative commentators and victims' rights advocates praised the decision as appropriate accountability for a calculating killer regardless of age. Talk radio hosts and cable news pundits pointed to the TikTok videos and journal entries as proof that Emma understood exactly what she was doing and deserved full adult consequences. If you're smart enough to plan a triple murder and practice your lies, one prominent conservative columnist wrote, you're smart enough to face adult justice. Progressive activists and juvenile justice reformers condemned the decision as a grotesque violation of international human rights standards and a dangerous precedent that could lead to children being executed for crimes committed before they were old enough to drive, vote, or drink. Amnesty International issued statements. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child expressed concern. Child advocacy organizations held press conferences warning that Texas was setting itself on a path toward becoming an international pariah, executing children in defiance of global norms. National media descended on Austin, turning the Girtz case into a referendum on juvenile justice, capital punishment, and the limits of childhood culpability. The courthouse where Emma would eventually stand trial became a flashpoint for protests, with demonstrators on both sides gathering regularly. On one side, people held signs reading "Justice for Daniel, Victoria, and Ethan, and adult crimes deserve adult time." On the other, activists carried placards declaring "Children are not adults" and "Abolish juvenile execution." The divide wasn't just legal or political, it was moral and philosophical, touching on fundamental questions about human nature, redemption, and justice. The Adult Accountability Act had been designed to send a message that violent crime committed by juveniles would not be tolerated or minimized. The Girtz case was delivering that message in the most dramatic way possible. But the law's supporters hadn't anticipated the visceral public reaction to seeing that principle applied to a 13-year-old girl, no matter how calculating her crimes. There's something deeply unsettling about the image of a middle schooler facing execution. Something that challenges our most basic assumptions about childhood, innocence, and the possibility of change. As the trial date approached, legal scholars began filing amicus briefs arguing both sides of the constitutional question. Some contended that executing a juvenile offender violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment and the Supreme Court's previous holdings recognizing categorical differences between juvenile and adult offenders. Others argued that sufficiently sophisticated premeditation erased the categorical distinction, that a 13-year-old who plans murder for months is functionally equivalent to an adult who does the same, at least for purposes of criminal responsibility. The stage was set for a trial that would be about far more than just Emma Grace Girtz's guilt or innocence. It would be about the fundamental question of whether children can be monsters, and if so, what society should do with them. Can a 13-year-old understand the finality of death well enough to be held fully accountable for causing it? Is redemption possible for someone who murders their family with such calculation? And perhaps most troublingly, if we execute a child for crimes committed while her brain was still developing, what does that say about who we are as a society? The trial of Emma Grace Girtz began on September 13, 2021, in a courtroom specially configured to accommodate the unique circumstances of prosecuting a 13-year-old for capital murder. The proceedings were officially closed to the public under juvenile protection statutes, but the courtroom was packed with court officials, expert witnesses, and a limited pool of credentialed journalists who had been granted access under strict confidentiality agreements. The atmosphere was tense, almost suffocating. Everyone in that room understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be studied and debated for decades to come. Emma sat at the defense table wearing a conservative blue dress that her attorneys had selected to emphasize her youth and vulnerability. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her expression was carefully neutral, not defiant, not remorseful, just blank. As Prosecutor Dylan Torres began his opening statement, the jury, 12 citizens of Austin who had survived an exhaustive voir dire process designed to identify people who could consider both the death penalty and the defendant's age, watched Emma closely, trying to reconcile the ordinary-looking teenage girl before them with the calculated killer described in the charging documents. Torres's opening statement was a masterpiece of narrative construction, designed to establish Emma not as a child, but as a sophisticated predator who had weaponized her age and appearance to attempt the perfect murder. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about 3 innocent people who were executed in their own home by someone they loved and trusted. Torres began, his voice measured and grave, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. Senator Daniel Girtz was shot in the chest while he stood in his bedroom, given no chance to defend himself or even understand what was happening. Victoria Girtz was shot in the back while she tried to flee, running toward her son's room in a desperate attempt to save him. An 8-year-old Ethan Girtz was shot in the head while he slept, a stuffed dinosaur in his hands, never knowing that the last moments of his life had arrived. Torres paused, letting the horror of those images sink in. Several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. The person who committed these executions planned them for months, practiced her deception for weeks, and carried them out with precision and calculation. Torres continued, turning to gesture at Emma. That person is sitting right there. And by the end of this trial, you will have no doubt, none whatsoever, that Emma Grace Girtz is guilty of capital murder. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 weeks, with Torres methodically presenting evidence in a sequence designed to build an irrefutable narrative of premeditation and deception. The first week focused on the physical evidence and timeline, establishing the basic facts of what happened that night. Detective Savannah Garcia was the star witness, walking the jury through the crime scene, the initial investigation, and the moment she realized Emma's story was impossible. Garcia's testimony was detailed and compelling. She described finding Emma on the porch with that rehearsed demeanor, the blood spatter on her clothes that looked staged rather than incidental, the absence of any signs of genuine trauma or shock. The jury saw crime scene photographs that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Senator Girtz lying on his bedroom floor, eyes open in surprise, a single bullet wound in his chest. Victoria collapsed in the hallway, shot twice in the back, her final moments clearly spent in terror trying to reach her son. And Ethan, sweet, innocent 8-year-old Ethan, tucked into bed with his dinosaur comforter, killed in his sleep by someone he trusted completely. The medical examiner provided detailed testimony about the nature of each wound, the trajectory of each bullet, the sequence of death. It was clinical, precise, and absolutely devastating. When Garcia testified about discovering Emma's fingerprints on the spare magazine hidden in her closet, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. This single piece of evidence demolished any remaining possibility that Emma had been truthful about an intruder. Why would Emma's fingerprints be on her father's ammunition? Why would that magazine be hidden in her closet? Torres didn't need to belabor the point. The implications were obvious. Emma had access to the gun, she'd handled the ammunition, and she'd hidden evidence in her room weeks before the murders. This wasn't the behavior of an innocent survivor. This was the behavior of someone planning a crime. The centerpiece of the first week was the audio evidence that proved Emma's timeline was a complete fabrication. Torres had the courtroom's audio system specially configured for this presentation. He wanted the jury to hear every detail with perfect clarity. First, he played the Ring doorbell recording from the neighbor's house. 3 distinct gunshots, captured with unmistakable clarity. 11:27 p.m., 11:28 p.m., 11:29 p.m. Then 18 minutes of silence. Not just quiet, absolute silence. No running footsteps. No car engines. No sounds of an intruder fleeing the scene. Nothing. Then Torres played Emma's actual 911 call, timestamped at 11:47 p.m. The jury heard her trembling voice claiming, "I think he's still in the house," and "I can hear someone downstairs." Statements that were demonstrably, mathematically false. The audio expert, Dr. Rachel Martinez, provided technical testimony explaining the microphone sensitivity, the sound propagation patterns, the absolute certainty of the timestamps. When Torres asked whether it was possible Emma's timeline was accurate, Dr. Martinez responded flatly, "No. The laws of physics don't lie. Those shots were fired 18 to 20 minutes before her 911 call. There is no margin of error here." Ms. Girtz was lying. The impact on the jury was visible and immediate. Several jurors leaned back in their seats, arms crossed, faces hardening. The audio evidence wasn't subject to interpretation or debate. It was objective, scientific proof that Emma had lied about the most fundamental aspect of her story. And if she'd lied about when the murders occurred, what else had she lied about? Everything, Torres's presentation suggested. The entire story was a performance, and the jury had just heard the proof. The second week of the prosecution's case focused on the digital evidence, and this was where the jury saw the true depth of Emma's planning and deception. Forensic analyst Marcus Webb testified about recovering the deleted locked journal entries and TikTok videos, explaining the technical process in language that non-experts could understand. Then, one by one, Torres played the TikTok practice videos for the jury. The progression from clumsy amateur to convincing performer. Emma alone in her bathroom, practicing crying, practicing the tremor in her voice, practicing the specific words she would use to report her family's murder. The jury watched in stunned silence as video after video played on the courtroom screens. Emma adjusting her facial expressions. Emma timing her pauses for maximum effect. Emma experimenting with different emotional registers until she found the perfect balance of fear and confusion. One juror, a woman in her 50s, was visibly shaking by the time the final practice video played. Emma's perfect performance, recorded just 24 hours before she used it for real. This wasn't a child who had acted impulsively. This was someone who had rehearsed murder like a school play. The locked journal entries were even more damning. Torres had the entries projected onto large screens in the courtroom, reading selected passages aloud in his calm, prosecutorial voice. December 14th, 2020. I would rather die than go to that place. Or maybe they should die instead. His voice was steady, letting the words speak for themselves. January 23rd, 2021. If I could get the gun, I could end this. All of it. He paused between entries, giving the jury time to absorb the progression. February 17th, 2021. Kill Dad first because he's the biggest threat, then Mom, then Ethan last because I don't want him to be scared. Each entry showed the jury that Emma had been thinking about, planning for, and refining her murder plot for months. This wasn't reactive violence. This wasn't a child snapping under pressure. This was systematic, calculated planning that would be sophisticated for an adult, let alone a 13-year-old. When Torres finished reading the entries, he turned to the jury and said simply, "These are not the words of a child acting on impulse. These are the words of someone who decided her family should die and then made it happen." The prosecution also presented testimony from Rebecca Martinez, Emma's school counselor, who described their conversations in the months before the murders. Martinez testified that Emma had seemed increasingly disconnected and desperate, talking about not being able to be herself at home, but that she had never expressed violent ideation or threatened anyone. Torres used Martinez's testimony to establish that Emma had access to supportive adults who could have helped her address her family situation through legal means, therapy, child protective services, emancipation proceedings. But she had chosen murder instead. The defendant had options, Torres told the jury during his examination of Martinez. She could have told her counselor about the abuse she now claims justified killing her family. She could have refused to take the medication she says made her feel like a zombie. She could have run away, called the police, told a teacher. Instead, she chose the path that ended with 3 people dead. That's not desperation. That's calculation. The third week featured expert testimony that established Emma as the shooter beyond any reasonable doubt. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Chun, provided detailed analysis of the wounds and the sequence of death, explaining that each shot had been precisely placed to be immediately or rapidly fatal. The gunshot residue expert testified that the GSR patterns on Emma's right hand and pajama sleeve were consistent with someone who had fired a handgun, not merely been present during a shooting. A firearms expert explained that the Glock 19 required deliberate action to fire. It had multiple safety mechanisms and a trigger pull weight of approximately 5.5 pounds, meaning each shot required conscious intent and physical strength. Perhaps the most devastating witness was Dr. Michael Chun, the forensic psychologist who had reviewed all of Emma's digital evidence and evaluated her developmental status. Dr. Chin testified that Emma demonstrated cognitive and planning abilities far above average for her age, with IQ testing placing her in the 97th percentile for verbal reasoning and executive function. This is not a developmentally delayed or impaired individual, Dr. Chin told the jury. Emma Grace Girtz has the intellectual capacity of an advanced high school student or college freshman. She understands cause and effect, can plan multiple steps ahead, and demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human psychology and investigation techniques. Torres then asked the critical question, "In your professional opinion, did the defendant understand that killing her family members was wrong?" Dr. Chin's answer was unequivocal, yes. Her journal entries show clear awareness that murder is illegal and punishable. Her practice videos show she understood she would need to deceive investigators. Her research into forensic techniques shows she knew the police would investigate and she needed to avoid detection. She knew it was wrong, and she did it anyway. The prosecution concluded with victim impact testimony, a controversial inclusion given Emma's age, but permitted under the Adult Accountability Act's provisions. Victoria Girtz's sister, Michelle Reynolds, testified about her sister's devotion to her family, her sacrifice of career to support her husband's political ambitions, her love for her children. She spoke through tears about holiday gatherings, about Victoria's dreams for Emma's and Ethan's futures, about phone conversations that would never happen again. Senator Girtz's chief of staff, David Patterson, described the senator's commitment to public service, his vision for Texas's future, his genuine belief that government could make people's lives better. Patterson's voice cracked when he talked about the senator's pride in his family, the photographs of Emma and Ethan that had covered his office walls, the way he'd light up when talking about their achievements and dreams. Most powerfully, Ethan's second-grade teacher, Mrs. Patricia Johnson, testified about the 8-year-old's enthusiasm for learning, his kindness to classmates, his excitement about a science project on dinosaurs he would never complete. She described a bright, sweet boy who loved to help others, who always had a smile and a question about how the world worked. He wanted to be a paleontologist, Mrs. Johnson said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was going to discover a new species of dinosaur and name it after his family. That was his dream. Emma took that dream away from him. She took everything away from him. By the time the victim impact testimony concluded, several jurors were crying openly. The emotional weight in the courtroom was almost unbearable. These weren't abstract victims. They were real people with hopes and dreams, and people who loved them. And they were gone because a 13-year-old girl had decided their deaths were preferable to being sent to a boarding school she was afraid of. Torres's closing argument brought all the evidence together in a narrative of calculated evil that he argued transcended Emma's age. The defense will ask you to see a child when you look at Emma Grace Girtz, Torres told the jury, standing directly in front of Emma at the defense table, forcing the jurors to look at them both simultaneously. They will ask you to consider her age, her immaturity, her claimed abuse and trauma. But I ask you to see what the evidence shows. A person who planned 3 murders over 3 months, who practiced her deception for 2 weeks, who researched how to avoid detection, who executed her plan with precision, and who then sat on her porch, covered in her family's blood, waiting to perform for the police. Torres's voice grew harder, more forceful. Age is just a number when the actions demonstrate adult-level calculation and adult-level cruelty. The evidence has proven beyond any doubt that Emma Grace Girtz is guilty of capital murder. Now you must decide what justice looks like for 3 innocent people who were executed by someone they loved and trusted. The prosecution had built a case that seemed virtually unassailable. The digital evidence, the audio timeline, the forensic analysis, the expert testimony, all of it pointed in one direction. Emma Grace Girtz had planned and executed a triple murder with chilling calculation. The only question remaining was whether her age would save her from the ultimate penalty, or whether the jury would decide that some acts are so heinous that childhood itself cannot excuse them. Sarah Williams faced an almost impossible task when she stood to deliver her opening statement to the jury. She couldn't dispute the facts of the murders. The evidence was overwhelming. She couldn't challenge that Emma had killed her family. Emma herself would eventually admit it. She couldn't even really argue that Emma hadn't planned the crimes in advance. The journal entries and practice videos made that undeniable. What Williams could do, and what she dedicated herself to with fierce determination, was reframe the narrative from one of calculating evil to one of desperate survival. Her goal was to paint Emma not as a monster, but as a child so systematically broken by psychological abuse that murder became, in her damaged mind, the only path to freedom. "You have heard the prosecution's story," Williams began, her voice softer than Torres's, but no less compelling. A story of a cold-blooded killer who murdered her family for convenience. But that story is incomplete. It tells you what Emma did without telling you why, without showing you the years of control, medication, manipulation, and terror that preceded those terrible acts. Yes, Emma killed her family. We're not going to dispute that. But understanding why she did it, understanding what was done to this child that broke her so completely, that's essential to justice. Williams's defense strategy centered on presenting Emma as a victim of prolonged psychological abuse who had developed what trauma experts call learned helplessness, a psychological state where someone subjected to uncontrollable, harmful circumstances eventually believes they have no agency, no options, no way out. Her capacity for rational decision-making, Williams would argue, had been fundamentally compromised by years of being medicated, controlled, and treated as a problem to be managed rather than a child to be loved. The murders weren't the actions of a calculating criminal. They were the predictable result of a damaged child whose normal coping mechanisms had been systematically destroyed. The defense called Dr. Elizabeth Warner, a renowned child psychologist specializing in family trauma, who had conducted extensive interviews with Emma and reviewed her medical, school, and therapeutic records. Dr. Warner's testimony was detailed and damning, not of Emma, but of her parents. She testified that Emma had been prescribed psychotropic medications starting at age 10, Zoloft for depression, Ritalin for attention issues, and at various times Ativan for anxiety, without consistent therapeutic support or proper monitoring of side effects. These medications can have serious impacts on developing brains, Dr. Warner explained, using visual aids to show how SSRIs and stimulants affect adolescent neurochemistry, including emotional numbing, dissociation, and impaired impulse control. Emma wasn't receiving therapy to address the root causes of her distress. She was being chemically managed, her symptoms suppressed rather than her problems addressed. This is particularly concerning because we know from her journal entries that she felt the medications made her feel like a zombie, disconnected from her own emotions. When you medicate a child into numbness without giving them healthy coping mechanisms, you're essentially removing their ability to process and respond to stress in normal ways. The defense presented evidence of the Girtz family's obsession with image control and political presentation, showing how Emma had been systematically erased as a person to serve her father's public image. Former campaign staffers testified about Senator Girtz's directive that Emma should not appear at public events after age 11 because she had become difficult to manage and didn't project the right family image. Think about that for a moment. A father deciding his daughter was too problematic to be seen in public, treating her not as a child he loved, but as a liability to be hidden away. School records showed that Victoria Girtz had withdrawn Emma from extracurricular activities she enjoyed, drama club, soccer team, art classes, because they interfered with family obligations. But those family obligations, it turned out, meant being available for staged photo opportunities when needed while otherwise staying invisible. Williams argued that Emma had been reduced to a prop in her father's political career, valued only when she could be controlled and discarded when she couldn't. She wasn't a daughter, Williams told the jury. She was an image problem that needed to be solved. The most explosive testimony came from former residents of behavioral modification programs similar to the New Horizons facility where Emma's parents had planned to send her. Williams called 3 witnesses, now adults, who had been sent to such programs as teenagers, and their descriptions were harrowing. Jessica Martinez, 24, testified about being sent to a Utah facility at age 14 and spending 6 months in an environment where any deviation from strict rules resulted in isolation, forced exercise until she vomited, and public humiliation designed to break her spirit. They told my parents I was being defiant and needed to be broken down and rebuilt, Martinez testified, her voice shaking even years later. What they actually did was destroy my sense of self and my ability to trust anyone. I would have done anything, literally anything, to avoid going back there. When I heard Emma's story, when I learned she'd found out she was being sent to one of these places, I understood immediately. That level of terror, that sense of having absolutely no escape, it does things to your mind. It makes you capable of considering options you would never otherwise consider. Another witness, David Chun, described similar experiences at a different facility, staff members screaming in his face for hours, being forced to stand facing a wall for an entire day as punishment for talking during silent time, watching other kids have complete psychological breakdowns under the pressure. These places don't reform you, Chin testified. They traumatize you. And if Emma believed she was going to be sent to one, if that was the future her parents had planned for her, I completely understand why she felt she had no options left. The defense also called Emma's former teachers and counselors to establish that she had been a bright, engaged student until approximately age 11, when her personality began to change in ways consistent with both the onset of forced medication and increasing parental control. Her 5th-grade teacher, Mr. James Wilson, testified that Emma had been a star student, creative, enthusiastic, always raising her hand to participate. But by 6th grade, it was like someone had turned off a switch, Wilson said. She became withdrawn, listless. Her spark was gone. I asked her parents to come in for a conference because I was genuinely concerned about the dramatic change. Mrs. Girtz made it very clear that further discussion was not welcome. She said they were handling it with medication and discipline. Looking back now, I wish I'd pushed harder. Maybe if someone had intervened then. Williams presented Emma's medical records showing the progression and dosage increases of her medications, highlighting that Emma had been prescribed adult-level doses of psychotropic drugs despite being a small-framed child who weighed barely 90 pounds at age 13. Dr. Warner testified that these medications, particularly in combination and at such high doses, could cause what's known as paradoxical reactions in some patients. Instead of reducing depression and anxiety, they can increase emotional dysregulation, dissociation, and in rare cases, violent ideation. I'm not saying the medications caused Emma to commit murder, Dr. Warner clarified under Williams's questioning. I'm saying they contributed to a psychological state where her normal developmental capacity for impulse control, consequential thinking, and emotional regulation was significantly impaired. She was a child whose brain was still developing, being given powerful psychotropic drugs that altered her brain chemistry, without proper therapeutic support to help her process what she was feeling. It's a recipe for disaster. The defense's most controversial strategy was to call Emma herself to testify, a decision that Williams knew could backfire spectacularly, but believed was necessary to humanize her client and show the jury the person behind the crime. Emma took the stand on the fourth week of trial, wearing the same conservative blue dress, her small figure almost swallowed by the witness chair. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she began to speak, and Judge Morrison had to ask her twice to speak up so the court reporter could hear. Williams walked her through her childhood, attempting to establish a baseline of normalcy before the control and medication began. Emma described relatively happy early years, birthday parties with friends, family vacations to the beach, bedtime stories read by her mother. But her effect remained flat, clinical, as if she were describing events that had happened to someone else. When Williams asked when things started to change, Emma's answer was matter of fact. Around fourth grade, when my dad started talking about running for state senate, my mom sat me down and explained that we were going to be a public family now, and that meant I had to be more careful about how I acted and what I said. This was when the image management began, coaching Emma on what to wear, how to smile for photographs, which opinions she was allowed to express. Emma described the onset of medication at age 10 after she'd had a public outburst at one of her father's campaign events where she'd complained loudly about being bored. The next week, my mom took me to a psychiatrist her friend recommended, Emma testified. I talked to him for maybe 20 minutes, and he diagnosed me with depression and ADHD. He prescribed Zoloft and Ritalin. My mom seemed relieved, like this solved a problem. When Williams asked how the medications affected her, Emma's description was disturbing in its detachment. At first, I just felt numb, like everything was happening behind a glass wall. My mom said that was good, that I was calmer and easier to manage. When I told the psychiatrist the medications made me feel like a zombie, he increased the dose and added Ativan for anxiety. Nobody seemed concerned about how I felt, just about how I behaved. The testimony turned darker as Emma described the escalating control over every aspect of her life. Her clothes selected by her mother, her social media monitored and eventually deleted, her friendships managed based on political usefulness. I wasn't allowed to do drama club anymore because my mom said acting would make me too comfortable with lying, Emma stated, the irony apparently lost on her. I couldn't play soccer because the weekend games interfered with campaign events. Everything I wanted to do was something they wouldn't allow. It felt like I was disappearing, like the real me was being erased and replaced with this fake version they needed me to be. Williams then addressed the discovery of the behavioral modification camp plan. Emma's testimony became slightly more animated here, her voice rising above its usual monotone. I heard my mom on the phone in March, maybe a week before it happened. She was talking to someone at a place called New Horizons, giving them my medical history and school records. I looked it up online after she hung up, and I found all these testimonials from kids who had been there, talking about isolation cells and forced exercise until they vomited and staff members who would scream in their faces for hours. How did that make you feel? Williams asked, the standard question designed to elicit empathy from the jury. Emma's answer was characteristically clinical. I felt like I didn't have a choice. I couldn't go to that place, but I also couldn't stay living like I was living. I started thinking about different options, running away, telling a teacher, calling Child Protective Services. But I knew none of those would actually work. My dad was a senator. People believed him, not me. The medications made it hard to think clearly. But one thought kept coming back. If they were gone, the problem would be solved. This statement, reducing her family's existence to a problem requiring a solution, was exactly what the prosecution had been arguing all along. Williams tried to redirect, asking Emma to explain what she meant, but the damage was done. Emma's inability to express genuine emotion, her clinical description of planning murder as solving a problem, only reinforced the prosecution's characterization of her as fundamentally lacking empathy. Williams walked Emma through the planning process, and Emma's testimony corroborated what the jury had already seen in the journal entries. She described researching her father's gun, learning how to operate it, planning the sequence of killings. I practiced the 911 call because I knew I had to sound believable, Emma admitted. I watched real emergency calls online to see how people sound when they're scared. I practiced in my bathroom where no one could hear me. I knew I needed to get the performance right or the police would suspect me immediately. Then came the testimony about the night of March 19th and Emma's clinical, step-by-step description of executing her family. I waited until everyone was asleep. I got the gun from my dad's safe using the backup key. I loaded it with the spare magazine I'd taken. I went to my parents' bedroom first. My dad was snoring. I stood at the foot of the bed and aimed at his chest. I pulled the trigger, and he woke up for a second and looked at me. But then he fell back and didn't move anymore. The courtroom was silent except for Emma's flat, emotionless voice. The shot woke my mom up, and she screamed and ran for the hallway. I followed her and shot her in the back near the stairs. She fell forward and didn't get up. Then I went to Ethan's room. He was still asleep with his dinosaur. I didn't want him to be scared, so I shot him while he was sleeping so he wouldn't know what was happening. Several jurors looked away, unable to maintain eye contact with Emma as she described murdering her 8-year-old brother with the casual detachment of someone discussing a homework assignment. Williams had hoped that putting Emma on the stand would help the jury see her humanity, understand her psychological state. Instead, it was revealing the depth of her disconnection from normal human emotion. Under cross-examination, Prosecutor Torres systematically destroyed any sympathy Emma's direct testimony might have generated. He forced her to confront the contradiction between claiming she had no choice and spending months meticulously planning every detail. You could have told your counselor, couldn't you? Torres demanded. You could have called Child Protective Services yourself. You could have run away. You had options that didn't involve murder. Emma tried to maintain that none of those options would have worked, but Torres cut through that explanation. You chose not to try any legal options because you'd already decided on murder, hadn't you? You'd been planning it for months. This wasn't desperation. This was calculation. The most devastating exchange came when Torres asked Emma about her brother Ethan specifically. You testified that you killed Ethan so he wouldn't have to grow up without parents, Torres said, his voice dripping with skepticism. But you were the one who made him an orphan by killing his parents. You created the very situation you claimed you were sparing him from, didn't you? Emma struggled to respond, her flat effect cracking slightly as she tried to explain the twisted logic that had made murdering an 8-year-old seem merciful. I knew if I only killed my parents, Ethan would be left alone, and he would have told the police I did it, and then I would go to prison, and he would still be alone anyway, Emma finally said. So it seemed better? Torres interrupted. Better for whom? Certainly not for Ethan, who's dead. Better for you, because it eliminated a witness. That's the truth, isn't it? Emma had no answer that could reconcile her claim of mercy with the reality of murdering a sleeping child. The final moment of Emma's cross-examination came when Torres asked her directly about remorse and empathy. Do you understand that your father, mother, and brother are dead and will never come back? Yes, Emma said quietly. Do you understand that Ethan will never grow up, never graduate from elementary school, never have a first date or learn to drive or have children of his own? Yes. And do you feel remorse for taking those possibilities away from him? Emma's answer, after a long pause. I feel bad that it had to happen that way, but I don't regret doing what I did because the alternative was worse for me. Torres let that answer hang in the air for a long moment. Worse for me. Not worse for the 3 people she'd killed. No further questions, he said quietly, returning to his seat. When Emma finally stepped down from the witness stand after more than 7 hours of testimony over 2 days, she had done irreparable damage to her own defense. Her flat effect, her clinical descriptions, her inability to express genuine remorse, her continued prioritization of her own comfort over 3 lives. all of it had convinced even those inclined towards sympathy that something fundamental was missing in her moral architecture. The defense concluded with additional expert testimony about adolescent brain development. Dr. Jennifer Blackwell returned to provide detailed explanation of how the prefrontal cortex's incomplete development in teenagers affects decision-making. But after Emma's testimony, the neuroscience felt almost irrelevant. The jury had seen Emma with their own eyes, heard her with their own ears. And what they'd seen was someone who seemed incapable of normal human empathy, regardless of brain development or abuse history. Williams's closing argument was an emotional appeal for mercy. Emma Grace Girtz did a terrible thing, Williams acknowledged, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. She took 3 lives, including that of her own little brother, and nothing can undo that horror. But this is a child who was medicated into compliance, controlled in every aspect of her life, and threatened with being sent to a facility that former residents describe as torture. She saw murder as her only escape because in her 13-year-old brain, distorted by years of abuse and powerful medications, it was the only escape she could conceive. Williams's voice grew stronger, more forceful. Punish her, yes. She must be held accountable for what she did. But don't execute her. Don't decide that a 13-year-old child is beyond redemption, beyond growth, beyond the possibility of becoming a different person than she is today. Give her life in prison if you must, but give her life. The question now rested with 12 citizens who had to decide. Was Emma a monster who happened to be 13, or a 13-year-old who had been turned into a monster? And what does justice look like when the answer might be both? The jury in the trial of Emma Grace Girtz received their instructions from Judge Patricia Morrison on October 8, 2021, after 5 weeks of testimony that had left everyone in the courtroom emotionally exhausted and spiritually drained. Morrison's instructions were lengthy and complex, covering the specific requirements for conviction under the Adult Accountability Act, the difference between capital murder and lesser included offenses, and the critical question of whether Emma's age should be considered a mitigating factor in determining guilt or only in determining punishment. You must first decide whether the defendant is guilty of capital murder as charged, Morrison instructed, her voice steady but carrying the weight of what she was asking these 12 ordinary citizens to do. If you find her guilty, you will then deliberate separately on the appropriate sentence, considering both the aggravating factors presented by the prosecution and the mitigating factors presented by the defense, including the defendant's age. What she didn't say, but everyone understood, was that they held a 13-year-old girl's life in their hands. The decision they were about to make would define not just Emma's future, but potentially the future of juvenile justice in America. The jury deliberated for 3 full days, sequestered in a hotel with no contact with the outside world, where media coverage of the trial had reached fever pitch. Leaked information from anonymous sources suggested the jury was deeply divided, not on the question of Emma's factual guilt, which the evidence made undeniable, but on whether a 13-year-old could be held to the same standard of culpability as an adult offender, and whether the death penalty could ever be appropriate for someone so young. The foreperson, a 52-year-old high school principal named Michael Torres, no relation to the prosecutor, would later describe the deliberations as the most emotionally difficult experience of his life, with several jurors breaking down in tears as they grappled with impossible moral calculations. During the deliberations, a piece of information emerged that would become one of the most controversial aspects of the trial. Emma had been observed by court deputies sketching in a notebook during jury deliberations, apparently unconcerned about the life or death decision being made about her future. One deputy, who spoke anonymously to a reporter, described Emma drawing what appeared to be fashion designs and doodles, occasionally smiling to herself, showing no visible anxiety or fear. When this information leaked to the media, it ignited another firestorm of public debate. Was this further evidence of Emma's fundamental lack of empathy and remorse? The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and the few members of Emma's extended family who were willing to be associated with her. The rest had publicly disowned her and sided with the victims. Emma was brought in wearing her standard blue dress, her expression neutral as always. She stood beside her attorneys as the jury filed in, their faces revealing nothing. The foreperson handed the verdict forms to the court clerk, who passed them to Judge Morrison. Morrison reviewed them briefly, her face betraying no emotion, before instructing the clerk to read the verdicts aloud. The courtroom held its collective breath. In the matter of State versus Emma Grace Girtz, case number CR 2021-4472, the clerk began, her voice steady despite the historic nature of what she was reading. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of capital murder in the death of Daniel Girtz. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of capital murder in the death of Victoria Girtz. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of capital murder in the death of Ethan Girtz. Emma showed no visible reaction to the guilty verdicts, maintaining the flat effect that had characterized her entire trial testimony. Her attorney, Sarah Williams, put a hand on her shoulder. Whether offering comfort or simply ensuring Emma remained standing was unclear. Prosecutor Dylan Torres nodded slightly in satisfaction, though his expression remained professionally neutral. This was the outcome he'd expected, but there was no joy in it. Only the grim satisfaction of justice served. Judge Morrison polled the jury individually to confirm the verdicts were unanimous, and each juror affirmed their vote of guilty, though several were visibly emotional as they did so. One woman in her 60s had tears streaming down her face. A younger man stared at his hands, unable to make eye contact with anyone. The weight of what they'd just done, convicting a 13-year-old of capital murder, was written on every face. With the guilt phase concluded, the trial would now move to the penalty phase, where the jury would decide whether Emma should be sentenced to death, life imprisonment without possibility of parole, or life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years. This was where the real battle would be fought, not over whether Emma had killed her family, which was no longer in question, but over whether a child deserved to die for it. The penalty phase began the following day with the prosecution presenting aggravating factors that they argued warranted the death penalty. Torres called additional witnesses to establish that the murders had been particularly heinous, atrocious, and cruel, the statutory language required for capital punishment under Texas law. He emphasized Ethan's vulnerability as an 8-year-old child, Victoria's terror as she was shot in the back while fleeing, and Daniel's betrayal by his own daughter in the moment of his death. Torres also presented evidence that Emma had shown no remorse or rehabilitation potential, citing her courtroom sketching during deliberations and her testimony where she'd said she didn't regret the murders because the alternative was worse for me. He painted a picture of someone so fundamentally broken, so incapable of normal human empathy, that she could never be safely released into society. This is not someone who made a terrible mistake, Torres argued. This is someone who is dangerous to her core, who will always be dangerous, who cannot be fixed or rehabilitated because the capacity for genuine human connection simply isn't there. The most theatrical moment of the penalty phase was Torres's closing argument, where he abandoned his usual measured prosecutorial tone in favor of an emotional, almost evangelical appeal for the ultimate punishment. Ladies and gentlemen, I have prosecuted murderers for 15 years, Torres began, his voice rising and falling with practiced dramatic effect. I have seen evil in many forms, crimes of passion, crimes of greed, crimes of rage. But I have never seen anything like Emma Grace Girtz. He gestured toward Emma, who sat impassively at the defense table, still sketching in her notebook. This is a person who planned the murder of her family for 3 months, who practiced her deception for 2 weeks, who shot her father in the chest, her mother in the back, and her 8-year-old brother in the head while he slept, who staged a crime scene, who called 911 and performed like an actress, who has shown no genuine remorse, no real empathy, no capacity for rehabilitation. Torres's characterization of Emma as America's youngest monster became the soundbite that would be replayed on news broadcasts worldwide, a phrase that encapsulated the prosecution's theory that Emma's age was irrelevant in the face of such calculated cruelty. The defense wants you to see a child, Torres continued, now pacing in front of the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. But children don't spend months planning murder. Children don't practice their 911 calls to perfection. Children don't execute their families and then sketch fashion designs while a jury decides their fate. Emma Grace Girtz may be 13 years old chronologically, but her actions are those of a sophisticated, remorseless killer who will never be safe to release into society. The only sentence that protects the public and delivers justice for Daniel, Victoria, and Ethan Girtz is death. The defense's penalty phase presentation focused entirely on mitigation. Williams called expert after expert to testify about adolescent brain development, the effects of abuse on decision-making, and Emma's potential for rehabilitation. Dr. Jennifer Blackwell returned to provide updated testimony about recent neuroscience research showing that the brain continues developing into the mid-20s and that adolescents are categorically less culpable than adults for criminal behavior. Emma is not a fully formed person yet, Dr. Blackwell testified, her passion for the science evident in every word. Her prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term consequential thinking and impulse control, won't be fully developed for another decade. To sentence her to death now is to say that who she is at 13 is who she will always be. And neuroscience tells us that simply isn't true. The teenage brain is remarkable in its plasticity, its capacity for change and growth. What seems like fixed personality traits at 13 can be completely different at 25. Williams also presented testimony from juvenile rehabilitation specialists who argued that even youth convicted of serious crimes can be successfully rehabilitated through proper treatment and education. Dr. Marcus Johnson, who ran a juvenile rehabilitation facility in California, testified about former residents who had committed serious violent crimes as teenagers and, after years of intensive therapy and education, had been released and become productive members of society. I'm not saying Emma could ever be released into the community, Dr. Johnson clarified, understanding the enormity of what she'd done. But I am saying that she has the capacity to change, to grow, to potentially become a different person than she is today. Executing a 13-year-old forecloses that possibility forever. It says we've given up on the fundamental premise of childhood, that people can change, can learn, can become better than they were. Williams's closing argument in the penalty phase was her last chance to save Emma's life, and she delivered it with passionate intensity, her voice breaking with genuine emotion. I'm not asking you to excuse what Emma did, Williams told the jury. I'm not asking you to forget Daniel, Victoria, and Ethan. I'm asking you to remember that Emma is a child who was abused, controlled, medicated, and terrorized by the very people who should have protected her. She paused, letting that sink in before continuing. I'm asking you to remember that our justice system has always recognized that children are different, less culpable, more capable of change. I'm asking you to give Emma life in prison, where she can be held accountable for what she did, but where she also has the possibility of growth, of rehabilitation, of one day understanding the magnitude of her actions and genuinely feeling remorse. Because right now, at 13, with a brain that's still developing and a psychology that's been damaged by years of abuse, she can't fully comprehend what she's done. But maybe someday she will. And if that day comes, shouldn't she be alive to experience it? The jury deliberated on sentencing for 4 agonizing days. On October 18, 2021, they sent a note to Judge Morrison indicating they had reached a sentencing decision. What happened next would become one of the most controversial moments in Texas legal history. The jury recommended life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years, explicitly rejecting the death penalty. The foreperson explained in a brief statement that while the jury found the crimes heinous and Emma's lack of remorse disturbing, they could not bring themselves to recommend death for someone who was 13 years old at the time of the offense. Several jurors were crying as the recommendation was read. However, under Texas's Adult Accountability Act, the jury's sentencing recommendation was advisory only. The final decision rested with Judge Morrison, who had the authority to accept the jury's recommendation or impose a different sentence if she found it warranted by the evidence and the law. For 2 weeks, Morrison took the case under advisement while political pressure mounted from both sides. On November 3, 2021, Judge Morrison issued her ruling in what was supposed to be a sealed courtroom. Despite security precautions, a journalist had smuggled in a hidden camera, and the footage would later leak, becoming one of the most viewed legal proceedings in history. Morrison began by acknowledging the jury's recommendation but stated that under the Adult Accountability Act, she was required to independently evaluate whether the sentence was appropriate. She systematically addressed each aggravating factor: the multiple victims, Ethan's vulnerability, the abuse of familial trust, the exceptional premeditation, Emma's lack of remorse. On each point, Morrison's analysis aligned with the prosecution, characterizing the murders as among the most calculated in Texas history. Then came the pivot that would shock the nation. However, Morrison stated, her voice cutting through the tense silence, the court must also consider that the defendant was 13 years old at the time of these crimes. While her planning was sophisticated, while her actions were heinous, the court cannot ignore the categorical difference between juvenile and adult offenders recognized by the Supreme Court and by basic human decency. Morrison paused, and for a moment, observers believe she was building toward accepting the jury's recommendation. Therefore, the defendant Emma Grace Girtz is hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. This was neither the death penalty the prosecution had sought nor the life with parole the jury had recommended. It was something in between, acknowledging Emma's youth enough to spare her execution, but declaring her beyond rehabilitation by denying any possibility of release. Emma would spend the rest of her life in prison, dying there whether she was 25 or 85, never knowing freedom again. Sarah Williams immediately filed notice of appeal, arguing that life without parole for a 13-year-old was itself cruel and unusual punishment. Torres, though disappointed not to get the death penalty, acknowledged that life without parole was still a significant victory. Emma would never walk free. The leaked footage showed Emma's face as Morrison pronounced sentence, her eyes widening slightly, her hand pausing mid-sketch, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no sound emerging. It showed Williams collapsing into her chair, the weight of professional defeat evident in her posture. It showed Torres maintaining a carefully neutral expression, professional victory tempered by the sobering reality of what had just happened. Within hours, the backlash was immediate and international. Human rights organizations condemned the sentence as violating international standards. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child issued a statement calling it a violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But conservative politicians praised Morrison's decision as a balanced approach, acknowledging Emma's youth while ensuring she would never harm anyone again. Emma was transferred to a special unit within Texas's maximum security prison designed to house juvenile offenders sentenced as adults. She would be held separately from adult prisoners, with limited access to education and rehabilitation programs. Critics argued this treatment was inhumane for a child. Supporters countered that Emma had forfeited her right to normal childhood when she executed her family. The case of Emma Grace Girtz became a defining moment in American juvenile justice, forcing a national reckoning with questions that had no easy answers. The leaked courtroom footage of Emma sketching during her sentencing became almost a Rorschach test. Some saw a remorseless monster deserving of ultimate punishment. Others saw a deeply damaged child who needed treatment rather than warehousing. In the months following sentencing, investigative journalists uncovered more details about Emma's home life that complicated the narrative. Former household staff testified about the Girtz family's obsessive control. Victoria's sister admitted she'd witnessed the controlling behavior and had tried unsuccessfully to intervene. None of this changed the legal facts. Emma had undeniably planned and executed 3 murders, but it raised uncomfortable questions about shared responsibility. As of late 2021, Emma Grace Girtz remained in prison, her appeals working through the court system. She turned 14 behind bars, a birthday marked by renewed media coverage and continued national debate. Her story had become a symbol for deeper arguments about juvenile justice, abuse and trauma, and the limits of legal accountability. The final irony was that the law under which she was sentenced, the Adult Accountability Act her father had championed, faced legal challenges that might be ruled unconstitutional before the appeals process concluded. If those challenges succeeded, Emma's sentence could be reduced to life with parole eligibility. If they failed, she would die in prison for crimes committed at 13. Either way, Emma Grace Girtz had permanently altered the landscape of juvenile justice in America, forcing society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the monsters we fear most are children. And sometimes the systems designed to protect children create the very monsters we fear. The question of whether Emma was born broken or broken by design remained unanswered. Perhaps it always would be. What was certain was this: 3 people were dead, killed by someone they loved and trusted. An 8-year-old boy would never grow up, and a 13-year-old girl would spend the rest of her life paying for the choice she made on that March night in 2021, a choice that destroyed not just her family, but any possibility of redemption or second chances. Justice, it seemed, looked like everyone losing.